This is the Wooting 60HE V2, the second iteration of Wooting's legendary 60HE, and one that, at least on paper, seems to be the keyboard on the bleeding edge when it comes to the high-performance keyboard market. Now, Wooting is a brand that's garnered quite the reputation over the past couple years, going from a community project to arguably one of the best-known keyboard brands on the market, but until now I haven't managed to get my hands on any of their boards, as while they have a legendary reputation, they carry a rather hefty price tag, which is why I and many others have opted for cheaper alternatives. But now that I've actually used a Wooting keyboard, I completely understand why they have such a high reputation in the keyboard world, as not only does the board perform amazingly, it has the highest degree of serviceability and moddability I've ever seen on a keyboard to date. The 60HE V2 and all of Wooting's other keyboards also have software that is so well designed and implemented, it has become my golden standard for keyboard drivers, and there are a myriad of other advantages the 60HE V2 has over the rest of the keyboard market in my opinion. So while Wooting's keyboards do carry a hefty price tag, they're well worth it in my opinion, and in today's video we're going to talk in depth about the 60HE V2's design, build, switches, acoustics, ergonomics, performance, its pros and cons, and much more. But before we get started, a big thank you to Wooting for sending the 60HE V2 over for review, and a massive thank you to all the channel members who support my work. If you enjoy these in-depth reviews, teardowns, or guides, consider becoming a channel member, as that is the best way to directly support the channel aside from subscribing and sharing the video with a friend, and being a channel member also has the perk of giving you exclusive early access to upcoming content, including videos like this one. And as always, this review will be completely unbiased, meaning you will get my honest opinions of everything I review here on the channel, with no affiliate codes, brand bias, or paid promos. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. For testing parameters, I used the 60HE V2 for around 4 weeks, daily driving the board for both work and gaming use. I also tested the board in its stock configuration for the majority of my testing. I did of course test multiple aftermarket switch types, but since I found the stock switches to be quite good, I stuck with them for the majority of my testing. Aside from the switches, the only other modification made to the board was swapping out the stock silicone case layering for the included alternate layering. And for firmware, I tested the board on firmware version 2.14.0-beta 1, the latest beta firmware version available at the time of this review. For versions, the 60HE V2 is available in a variety of versions and colorways. Firstly, we have the pre-built aluminum case version, which retails for 320 Canadian dollars and comes in black or silver white colorways. Next, we have the ABS case version, which retails for 251 Canadian dollars, but only comes in a black colorway currently. Alternatively, you can also purchase the 60HE V2's PCB module itself for 195 Canadian dollars, but you'll need to supply your own case, switches, and keycaps if you choose this option. All the above versions are available in ANSI or ISO layouts, both of which now finally support split spacebars, something I'm extremely happy to see adopted here. And due to the 60HE V2's moddability, there are also a variety of alternative case options available on Wooting's website, such as the newly released silicone case, along with several alternative case types from aftermarket sources, and there are a bunch of other accessories for the board such as wrist rests, allowing for essentially endless customization for the 60HE V2 and Wooting's other keyboards, which is a great thing to see. And in today's video, I'll be using the pre-built 60HE V2 in the white-silver colorway. For packaging, the board comes in a rather unassuming, minimalistically designed box, which doesn't share much information about its contents aside from some regulatory information on its top here. But one really cool design aspect to the packaging is that the keyboard on the front here is printed with ASCII, with Wooting text used for its shadowing, which is a really cool design for the box here. Opening the box by disconnecting a flap here, we'll find a QR code and a URL for the board's quick start guide, and next to that we have a large envelope, which contains a Wooting themed postcard and stickers, which are nice little extras to see included. Mrs. mel0n really likes the stickers specifically, and I'm sure she's gonna steal them once I'm done with this review. Moving on, nested in the bottom of the box, we'll find a plastic dust cover for the board, something that oddly isn't included with many high performance boards, but something I'm very happy to see included here. Under that, we'll find the 60HE V2 itself, which comes wrapped in a thick protective wrapper, and since this is the pre-built model, everything is pre-installed in the board, meaning you can can just plug the board in and start using it. Under where the board was, there's also a small little disclaimer and guide that explains how to properly orient switches into the board's PCB, which is something I'm quite happy to see, as other boards don't always include this information, and it's very useful for users who are new to HE keyboards. Next, slotted into the rear part of the packaging, we'll find the signature Wooting strap, a staple of their keyboards. Now, since I have the silver-white colorway, the strap is a matching white-yellow design, but if you get the black colorway of the 60HE V2, the strap will come in a black-yellow style. Under where the strap was, we'll find the board's stock cable, which is a thicker, rigider type as expected for a keyboard cable. This cable also comes with a wrapper pre-installed on it, but uniquely, this cable is a USB-C to C type with a USB-C to A adapter pre-installed on its end. This is something I'm actually quite happy to see, as USB-C is now the standard, and having other boards include USB-A to C cables is always a little disappointing, so I'm very glad to see Wooting include a more future-proof cable style here. It's also worth noting that the cable's colorway will match that of the strap, meaning that on the silver-white colorway, the cable will be the aforementioned white-yellow style, while the black colorway's cable will be the black-yellow style. Also in the rear section of the box, we'll find a large bag, which includes a plastic keycap and switch puller, which is decently functional, though the switch puller end is a little weak in my opinion. Next, we have a unique key-like tool, which is used to remove the PCB-A module from the case via slots installed into it. This is a great accessory to see included, as it makes removing the PCB modular much easier as opposed to pulling it out by the keycaps or the switches. Also included in this baggie, we have extra screws and silicone plugs for the PCB module, along with the attachments needed to mount the aforementioned strap. And there are also alternative mounts and covers for the strap's mount on the side of the keyboard, allowing you to swap its position or remove it entirely if needed. And lastly, we have a package of 3 extra Lecker Ticken switches. The stock switch is included with the pre-built 60HE V2, which is great to see included, as if a switch fails, you can replace it easily without having to wait for replacement ones to be delivered. And lastly, in the very bottom of the packaging, you can remove a large insert here, which contains an optional EPDM case foam, which you can swap out for the silicone layer pre-installed to alter the board's acoustics, and we'll talk more about this foam and the board's overall acoustics later in this video. And lastly, for warranty, Wooting's keyboards are very unique compared to the rest of the market, as the 60HE V2 comes with a 4-year manufacturer warranty, which is the longest warranty period I've seen provided on any peripheral to date. However, there are some terms and conditions for this warranty, as the board's lighting only has a 2-year coverage period, but you can find all the terms and conditions for their product's warranty over on their website. As a preface to this segment, keep in mind that my keyboard was sent to me directly by Wooting, so take the build quality and QC of my unit with a grain of salt. However, that said, the overall build quality and QC of my board is absolutely superb, as not only is the board essentially perfect, its design is incredibly unique. Now, starting off with build quality, every aspect of my board is perfect with no issues with the case, the dampening foam, the PCB modular, the switches, or the keycaps. And on the topic of the board switches, they're all well lubed and are consistent in their actuation weights on my board, and the aluminum case also has the benefit of having an anodized coating applied to it, making it more durable and corrosion resistant, meaning that sweat isn't going to damage it over long-term use in most cases, which is a great attention to detail. But what I really want to focus on in this segment is the board's construction, as unlike other keyboards, the 60HE V2's design is entirely modular. Starting off with the PCB-A, it's constructed of an FR4 fiberglass plate, which has PET film and a pour-on layer installed on top of it, along with the PCB itself. There's also an added silicone layer that wraps around the module, allowing the whole thing to be friction mounted into the case, using a similar process that's used to anchor many travel mug lids. This design also has the benefit of being anti-static, meaning if the case becomes statically charged, it won't damage the board's PCB, and they also added a small metallic sponge beside the USB-C port, which also prevents any static discharge from occurring and damaging the PCB. And since the PCB assembly is modular, you can freely remove it from the case along with its case foam, and on the PCB itself, you can remove or mod the switches, keycaps, and stabilizers, and even the layers inside the module if desired. Another cool attention to detail here is that the board is pre-tape modded, as this backing that's applied to the PCB acts as a tape mod of sorts, while also giving a bunch of technical information about the board's PCB layout, which is something I can appreciate from a technical point of view. The board's modular design, aside from its performance and software, is one of my favorite aspects of the 60 60HE V2. As those of you who have watched the channel for a long time know, I value repairability and serviceability very highly, and seeing a keyboard that is so serviceable is a breath of fresh air in a market that rarely allows for any degree of serviceability, and the modular design also has the benefit of allowing for essentially infinite customization of the case, acoustics, switches, and keycaps, something that's quite rare on high-end keyboards. However, one nitpick I do have about the board is its base feet, as while they're made of a grippy material, they're a little on the small side for a board of this size. I found that in some cases the board was pretty easy to shift accidentally. Now while this is a pretty minimal nitpick, on a future version of the 60HE, I'd love to see larger base feet used so the board would anchor itself a little stronger. And as a last note, during my testing period I accidentally spilled some liquid into my board, and considering how spills are usually a death sentence for any keyboard, I was worried I fried my review unit, but since the board is so serviceable, I was able to fully disassemble it, allowing me to clean the inner layers of the PCB module, which allowed the board to survive this unfortunate mishap. Now to be clear, this does not mean the board is spill-proof by any means, however its higher degree of serviceability increases its survivability significantly compared to other keyboard types in my opinion, as I've never had a keyboard survive any kind of liquid damage before. For switches, in its pre-built configuration, the 60HE V2 comes with the Leckerticken medium switches, which are a custom switch developed by Wooting specifically for their keyboards. These switches are the expected linear style, being rated for a 42 gram force actuation weight and a bottom-out force of around 54 grams. They also utilize 22mm internal springs and support a total travel range of 4mm, along with a cycle rating of 100 million cycles. These switches are also pre-lubed, and said factory lubing has been applied consistently across all of my switches, and none of them have any scratching or inconsistent actuation or any other noticeable issues from my testing. For the stock switch's physical design, the base of the switch is made of nylon, and notably the base is solid, which is a very good thing, as the switch's lubing can't leak out, an issue I've experienced on other magnetic switches that have open bases. Moving on to their top housing, it's made of a semi-transparent polycarbonate, and the stem is made of the traditional palm material, and said stem uses a traditional MX style mount. And as I mentioned a moment ago, all the switches on my board were consistent in both their performance and actuation weights, but if in the rare situation a switch does fail or have any other issues over the lifespan of the board, you can simply replace any problematic switches due to their hot swap nature with the extra included switches or your preferred aftermarket kind. For stabilization, the stock switches are also quite good, though on the larger keys they do have a bit more play to them than I expected given the board's price, but this is more so due to their stabilizers rather than the stock switches themselves. Thankfully though, the looseness of said larger buttons didn't impact their performance, but if you want a firmer, more stable feel to these larger buttons, you can swap out the stock stabilizers easily as they're screw mounted into the core PCB, yet another benefit of the board's more serviceable and moddable design. Moving on to performance, overall I actually quite like these Leckerticken switches as they're very balanced in terms of their actuation weights, being not too light or too heavy, hence their balanced feel, which allows these switches to perform great in both typing and gaming use cases. Personally speaking, I find them to be very similar to the Gateron Jade Pros, just with a slightly heavier actuation weight and a longer travel range, being 4mm instead of 3.5mm. And seeing as the Jade Pros are my go-to switches for magnetic boards, given their similarities, I was actually quite happy with the stock switch's performance, hence why I use them for the majority of my testing. And in terms of audio feedback, here's how the stock switches sound in the board's stock configuration with the pre-installed silicone case layer. However, while these switches feel and perform great, one odd quirk to them is that the RGB diffuser inside them sometimes pops out of the switch's housing when they're removed. This is something I've never seen happen on any magnetic switch to date, as generally speaking the light diffuser is built into the top and bottom housing of the switch, but here, since it's a separate piece, it can pop out if enough pressure is applied to it when removed. Thankfully though, it can be reinstalled easily, so it's not an issue per se, but keep this odd quirk in mind if you plan on removing them. And since the 60HE V2 utilizes Hall effect sensors, just like every other HE keyboard, you can use other HE switch types here, but unlike other HE boards, the 60HE V2 supports every single kind of magnetic switch, and the process of installing and calibrating other switch types is incredibly easy, as all you need to do is install them into the PCB, select the switch or the closest analog and utility, and the board will automatically calibrate its sensors to the switches without the need for manual calibration. And from my testing, and as I mentioned at the top of this video, I tested a variety of alternative magnetic switch types in the 60HE V2, and they all worked perfectly, even the ones that weren't listed in Utility Switch Selector. And as a last note regarding durability, you'll likely see some brands advertise that magnetic switches aren't as consistent as mechanical or optical switch types, as they claim their magnetic nature can cause inconsistencies in their performance. This, to be completely honest, is a nothing burger critique, as the magnets inside these switch types are permanent, not temporary, being made of neodymium and iron boron within nickel plating in this particular case, and this type of magnet is not only extremely durable, they're also consistent in their flux, and the only way said flux will naturally change will be over literally thousands of years, and even then the decay rate of said flux is extremely minimal. This means that the spring inside the switch will fail long before there'll be the slightest of change in its magnetic flux, and since magnetic switches are serviceable, unlike optical switch types, even if the spring fails, you can simply open the switch, replace the spring with a new one, and continue to use the switch until the spring fails again, at which you can just continue to repeat this process over and over again. Now, the only way for a magnet to be demagnetized or have its flux altered in the short-term period would be for it to be exposed to extreme heat, specifically 80 Celsius or higher in this case. But seeing as a switch's magnet will never be exposed to temperatures remotely close to this, there's no reason to be concerned about the consistency or durability of the magnets inside the magnetic switches here. That said though, one issue area you might experience with HE keyboards is that if they're exposed to other magnetic sources or anything metallic, the Hall effect sensors inside the board can false trigger in some cases, which is why you can't use HE boards on metal desks. But for any interference to happen, you'd have to rest something magnetic or metallic directly against the keyboard, something that you obviously won't be doing, so the supposed potential for interference here is a non-issue in my opinion. And speaking from personal experience, I've been using HE keyboards for over 2 years, and I've never had any interference with any magnetic switch types, even the cheaper budget-oriented ones. So if you were considering the 60HE V2 or any other HE keyboard for that matter, and were hesitant to pull the trigger due to the supposed weakness of these switch types, rest assured magnetic switches are extremely consistent, and there's a reason why so many pro players use HE boards, most notably Wootings, as they're the best you can get when it comes to performance, durability, and consistency. For performance, unsurprisingly given the reputation of Wooting's keyboards, the 60HE V2 performed fantastically across the board, pun intended. A big reason for this is the PCB's latency, as Wooting is advertised the module has an average latency of 0.125 milliseconds, but more importantly, the board also supports an 8000 Hz scan rate, allowing for true 8K Hz polling. This is a very important aspect, as many other keyboards offer 8K polling, but those boards will have lower scan rates, resulting in subpar performance. But since the 60HE V2 has an 8K scan rate and 8K polling, this isn't an issue area here, and said polling rates, as expected, were very well implemented here. However, it's important to note, to achieve the lowest latency and max scan rate here, you'll need to activate tachyon mode in Utility. This mode disables and or slows down the board's RGB related features, allowing the maximum processing power to be allotted to the board's connectivity and scan rates. With the tachyon mode disabled, the board scan rate drops to around 2400 Hz, and the latency drops down to around 0.416 milliseconds. So if you want to get the maximum performance out of the 60HE V2's hardware, be sure to enable tachyon mode. And in addition to the native polling and scan rates here, due to the Hall effect sensors and compatibility with magnetic switches, the board sports a slew of additional performance features. First off, and as expected for an HE board, the V2 supports adjustable actuation and rapid trigger, which allows you to customize the trigger and reset points from each switch on the board, anywhere between the stock switch's 0.1 to 4mm range, which is adjustable in increments of 0.05mm. Personally speaking, I set my switches to actuate at 0.2mm and the rapid trigger to reset the key at 0.5mm, but you can experiment with what points feel best for you, and as I mentioned earlier, if you use other types of magnetic switch types here, the board will automatically calibrate to said switch's travel range, even if it's shorter or longer than the stock ones here. The next feature we have is Rapid Snappy, which continually compares two key actuations and prioritizes the key with the higher actuation range. This allows movement keys like A and D to instantly change direction when strafing without waiting for one key to fully reset, allowing for faster inputs and reactions in game, and this feature can be bound to any key on the keyboard, not just the A and D keys. Moving on, we have Rapid Tappy, which is better known as SOCD, and this feature is similar to Rapid Snappy, but operates slightly slightly differently, as this version prioritizes the last input, meaning that if two keys are actuated, the last input will be prioritized while the other one will be deactivated, and this feature can be bound to your preferred keys as well and has 4 operational modes. However, both rapid snappy and tappy are rather frowned upon in Counter-Strike, as they can technically give you an unfair advantage when strafing, meaning if you're going to use this feature you will get kicked from matches, so be sure to disable these features if you use the 60HE V2 in Counter-Strike. Next, the board supports dynamic keystroke, DKS for short, which allows you to bind up to 4 different actions to a single keystroke via 4 modes. Another notable feature here on the 60HE V2 is that it also supports simulated controller inputs, as the actuation range of the magnetic switches can be utilized as an analog input similar to that of a controller. This feature has a variety of use cases, but most importantly, it allows for a wider range of motion, as instead of the traditional 8-way movement of most keyboards, the controller input allows for a 360-degree range of motion. However, this feature only is supported in some game types, and if a key is set to emulate a controller input, it can't be used as a traditional key input. And lastly, the board also supports toggle key, which is fairly self-explanatory, along with remap and mod tap, which allows you to customize the keybinds of the board or add secondary actions to a key, allowing a 60% layout like the one here to have essentially infinite functionality. And if you want to learn more about these performance features or about any aspect of Wooting's products for that matter, check out their YouTube channel, as it is a figurative treasure trove of information. But one of the most important performance features here is that the board also supports the optional split spacebar, which is a feature I'm incredibly happy to see adopted here, as my previous main HE board, the Psychic-Keep HM80, also used a split spacebar, and it became a feature I honestly can't live without, as you can bind extra keys to these extra buttons, freeing up mouse buttons or other keys. And because of the utility of the split spacebar on the HM80, I've stuck with that board for almost 2 years now, as no other good HE boards have adopted a split spacebar style, hence why I'm so happy to see it finally adopted here, as I can finally upgrade to a more modern board. However, it's worth noting, by default the middle spacebar button is bound to function, which is useful for alternative layouts or functions, but in-game it can be a bit of an issue, so I'd recommend rebinding it via utility so you can utilize it properly. But while overall the 60HE V2 is an incredibly impressive board, both in terms of performance and features, one aspect that does hold it back for me personally speaking is its form factor. As while a 60% layout is great for gaming, for general use I personally prefer larger layouts like 75 or 80%, as I like having a physical F-row. So sadly, the 60HE V2, despite its great performance, won't be replacing my daily driver work keyboard due to its layout, but for gaming use the V2 is absolutely going to be my go-to keyboard for the foreseeable future, as not only does the board perform amazingly, the split spacebar makes an already exceptional keyboard even better. For stock keycaps, the 60HE V2 uses PBT keycaps, but they are on the thicker side as they have a transparent inner layering, and due to their thicker design, not only do the keycaps feel great, they also have a slightly better acoustic profile compared to thinner keycap styles, but we'll talk more about that aspect of the board in a moment. Now for the keycaps profile, they have an OEM profile which is similar-ish to a traditional cherry profile, however the keys are slightly taller here, resulting in the aforementioned OEM profile. But if you want to use alternative profiles or keycaps here, since the switches use MX style stems, you can swap the keycaps out for your preferred set easily. Now the stock keycaps are mostly solid, but their legend is semi-transparent as it's inlaid into the keycap, hence the transparent inner layering, which allows the board's lighting to shine through the keycap's legend, and this also ensures that over long-term use, the lettering on the keycaps won't be worn away. And as expected, given the switches use an MX style stem, these keycaps are MX style mount, meaning they're essentially universal with most switch types. These keys also have the unique benefit of having a more granular surfacing, which makes the keys quite grippy. That said though, they're not as grippy as the Huntsman V3 Pro's keycaps, which are the grippiest keycaps I've used to date, but compared to other boards' keycaps, they are grippier, which is a great thing to see, but admittedly I'd love to see a more granular, grippy keycap used on future models, but this is a very minimal nitpick. But one unique aspect to the split spacebar implementation here is that the keys do differ in size slightly, as the less left spacebar is 45mm wide, whereas the rightmost one is 36mm wide, and the central one is 17mm wide. This, as it turns out, is an intentional decision, as it allows the split spacebar to be more compatible with aftermarket keycaps, as the spacebars are the same size as the right shift, mod key, and left shift, meaning finding keys for the split spacebar is much easier here compared to other split spacebar implementations, which is a great attention to detail. And as I mentioned earlier, the board split spacebar is very well implemented, and I hope Wooting continues to offer it on their future boards. Moving on to ergonomics, the aluminum case version of the 60HE V2 has a natural 6-degree tilt, which is within the usual range we commonly see from most 60% layout boards. However, this case doesn't offer any height adjustment, which is something I expected to see here, especially considering the board's price. However, the natural tilt of the board is very comfortable to use for both gaming and typing use cases, but I do have larger hands, so my usage experience won't reflect that of more normal sized hands. But regardless, with my hand size, the board was very comfortable to use, and I didn't have any issues with misactuating the board's bottom row, an issue I've had on many previous HE keyboards regardless of their size. And circling back to the lack of height adjustment here, a way Wooting could address this would be to make the base feet larger and include angled or rounded attachments for the base, which would allow for not only better anchoring, but also adjustable height, and hopefully that's something we see implemented on Wooting's future boards. For acoustics, the stock Lecker Tekin switches, thicker keycaps, aluminum case, and silicone case layering give the 60HE V2 fantastic stock acoustics, having a deeper, marbly, thonky sound to it, which offers just enough acoustic feedback to give the board a satisfying usage experience, but not to the degree where it becomes overbearing. And as mentioned earlier, in the pre-built configuration, the board includes alternative case layers in the form of a layer of EPDM foam, or alternatively you could remove said foam to give the board more pronounced acoustics. And to show the various acoustic profiles of the 60HE V2, here's how the board sounds in its stock configurations with the stock and a couple alternative switch types. For lighting, the 60HE V2 sports quite pronounced lighting, something I didn't necessarily expect for a high-end performance-focused board, but despite my general distaste for lighting, I actually quite like the implementation here. Now, the board's lighting comes from these north-facing nodes on the PCB assembly, which are spread by the diffusers slotted into the switch's housing. To complement the lighting, and as we just talked about, the keycaps legends are transparent, meaning that the board's lighting shines through the lettering and around the keycaps themselves, giving the board a nice accented lighting that's not too overpowering in my opinion. The board also supports a wide variety of lighting effects, all of which can be customized via utility, and we'll go over the board's lighting options in a couple minutes. However, as I mentioned earlier, when the tachyon mode is enabled, some of the board's lighting features will be disabled or dimmed, but even in this mode, the board's lighting looks great and the performance benefits are worth the trade-off in my opinion. But as a note here, due to the north-facing positioning of the lighting nodes, this is why Wooting include that little disclaimer on how to properly install the switches in the board, as if they're positioned in the wrong way, the board's lighting won't function, so make sure you orient the switches properly if you end up reseating the stock ones or installing aftermarket types. For the board's onboard controls, in its stock form there's a variety of onboard controls and shortcuts. However, you can bind additional key shortcuts via utility, and we'll talk about that process in a moment. Now starting off, to view all the board's onboard controls, you can hold down the function key and the board will illuminate all the bound keys, and you can also use this in combination with the top row to utilize the F row keys. Next, for profiles, by default the board has 2 profiles pre-installed, but you can add up to 4 total profiles in the board's onboard memory, and you can access said profiles by pressing function plus O, P, open or close bracket, and you can also cycle through the profiles by pressing function plus enter. Next, to utilize arrow keys without using rebind or mod tap, you can press function and use WASD or the alt menu control and question mark keys. For media controls, you can press function plus M less than or more than to unmute or decrease the volume, and you can press function plus J, K, and L to skip forward, backward, and play or pause. To adjust the board's LED brightness, you can press function plus semicolon or apostrophe to decrease or increase said brightness. And lastly, to disable the Windows key, you can press function plus Windows to disable it. But if needed, you can adjust these onboard controls or create your own via utility, so let's talk about that process next. For software, this is where the 60HE V2 and Wooting's other boards for that matter differentiate themselves from the rest of the market, as their driver called Wootility is the best keyboard software I've seen to date, so much so it is the golden standard for a driver in my opinion. Now Wootility comes in 2 versions, installable and web-based, both of which share essentially the same layout and usage experience. However, the installable version does have a few extra features that I wanted to highlight today, so we'll be talking about that version. Now once you launch into Wootility and connect your keyboard, the driver will automatically apply any needed firmware or software updates, and the process of this is completely automatic, and during the update process the keyboard even lights up the number row to show the status, and once any updates are applied, Wootility will auto launch the new setup guide. This guide will ask you some questions, namely if you're going to be using the stock ones or alternative switch types, and you can also select your arrow key layout, of which there are a variety of options. Personally speaking, I prefer the mod tap arrows, but you can use whatever fits your style the best, and after a final check, the setup process is finished and you can load into Wootility. Once inside, the software will load into a default splash page in which you can select your profile, adjust the switch's actuation point, and adjust the rapid trigger feature, enable or disable tachyon mode, and you can edit these settings per key by selecting the keys you want to edit from the readout here. To the left of the splash page, we'll find the rest of the board's settings, which are divided into 3 main tabs: keyboard, settings, and help, all of which have their own submenus. Starting off with the keyboard tab, the first submenu is the quick settings tab we just spoke about, as it serves as the aforementioned splash page of sorts for Wootility. In the next tab called profiles, you can configure the board's onboard profiles. By default they'll have 2, but you can use up to 4 in the onboard memory, and you can store additional profiles in the driver in this inactive slot here. But one really cool feature here is that you can import profiles via codes, so if you want to try a pro player's config, you can input their codes here and try them out for yourself. Wootility also has a brand new feature that's currently in beta called Application Link, in which you can configure Wootility to automatically swap the board's profile when a set exe is launched, and this feature supports up to 10 exes as of now. This is a really cool feature, as you can configure this to use specific keyboard layouts or shortcuts alongside with unique actuation points and performance profiles per game or program without you having to manually adjust profiles. But keep in mind this feature is currently in beta, so you might run into bugs or other issues, but if you want to beta test this feature, you can install the latest beta update on the installable version of Wootility, but for this process to run you will need to install Wootility's background service, and I'll show how to do that in a moment. Moving on to the actuation tab, here we can adjust the actuation points of the board switches the same as we could on the splash page, but in this tab there's a visualizer you can use to fine-tune the actuation point, which makes configuring this feature a little easier. In the next tab called Rapid Trigger, you can enable or disable Rapid Trigger on the board's keys, configure their reset points, and you can enable split sensitivity, which allows you to separate the enable and disable points of this feature, and you can enable continuous rapid trigger on this page as well. Next, in the RGB settings tab, we can configure the various lighting related features of the board, but there are a lot of configuration options here, far too many for me to cover in this video, but I will say in short, all the expected lighting related features are here, and the process of customizing the board's lighting is quite easy. Moving on to the remap tab, here you can configure configure the key layouts on the board and its various layers, and you can simply reconfigure a key by simply drag and dropping the desired rebinder function to the button in the readout here. This even applies to the function layers, meaning you can create your own shortcuts or binds and assign them as needed. However, there's no macro editor currently in Wootility, which hopefully will be added in the future to add even more functionality here. And another awesome feature to see here is that Wootility also supports alternative layouts such as Dvorak, Coleman, Workman, and a few others, and you can enable said layout by simply clicking the button, as it will automatically apply to the entire board, meaning you don't have to manually assign each key to your desired layout like you have to on other boards. Shockingly, this is a very rare feature to see on high performance keyboards, and while it's a very niche feature, I'm very happy to see it included here in Wootility. In addition to the remap tab, we also have another configuration tab called Advanced Keys, in which you can enable, configure, or disable rapid, snappy, and tappy, dynamic keystroke, mod tap, and toggle key, and any advanced key configurations or shortcuts will be listed in this window here, and you can remove or configure them at will. And lastly, for this section of Wootility, we have the Gamepad tab, in which you can configure the board's controller emulation, such as the controller type, the report rate, and you can assign buttons to the board similar to how you did in the Remap tab, just by drag and dropping the desired bind to a key in the readout. You can also configure the analog input curve, alter some additional settings, and just like there was in the Actuation tab, there is a visual readout for the analog curve and some other settings here, which makes configuring these settings a little easier. Alright, that's everything for the keyboard tab, and next let's move on to the settings tab here. In the first tab called General, we can enable the compatibility mode, set the board's polling rate, which is a global setting, to 1000 or 8000 Hz, alter the numlock indicator behavior, set the RGB sleep and dim timers, enable the debounce filter for the board's keys, enable Chroma Connect, which syncs the board's lighting with those of a Razer device, and lastly for this window there is also an option to factory reset the board. In the next tab we have the switch selector I talked about earlier, which is one of the best features on Wooting's boards in my opinion. Now the board, as mentioned earlier, is compatible with every type of magnetic switch, as it will auto-calibrate itself to most switch types. However, Wooting has certified several switches which are fully optimized for usage here on the 60HE V2 and their other boards. And if you plan on using alternative switch types here, once they're installed into the PCB, you can find the switch inside the list here or whatever's closest to it, and the board will auto-calibrate the travel ranges and the sensor sensitivity to the new switches without the need to manually calibrate them, as you often have to do on other AG keyboards. You can even configure the switch settings to a specific switch, meaning if you want to swap a particular key or just the WASD keys, you can calibrate those switches specifically without impacting the rest of the board. And another really niche but cool feature here is that there's even settings for spacers and O-rings, a feature I haven't seen on any AG board I've used to date. Next, moving on to the tab called Updates, here you can check for any available updates for the board or its software, and you can also enable beta updates if you want to try new features such as the application link profile switcher we talked about earlier. In the next tab we can adjust the software's language, and it even shows the percentage of the localization of each language, which is really cool to see. And there are also features to change the display mode for the software, though currently they're unavailable, but they should be added soon. And lastly we have the background services tab, which links to the add-on for Wootility that allows for the application linking we talked about a moment ago. And the process of installing this add-on and setting up is quite easy, and you can even configure what data sources the add-on can read, which I'm shocked to see, as usually softwares will just do whatever they want without user's authorization. G-Hub. So being able to control this aspect of the add-on is a great thing to see. And in the last section for Wootility, we have the built-in Help tab, which you can find support information for all their boards along with troubleshooting information, and in the bottom left of this tab there is a button that will take you to the board's error logs, which you can send to support if they need to diagnose an issue, which is another great attention to detail, as it makes troubleshooting process for the board much easier for the user without them having to dig through their system files to find a log. And that's everything that Wootility currently has to offer. Overall, I'm incredibly impressed with Wooting's driver, as both the installable and web versions are amazingly implemented, and compared to the drivers of other high performance boards I've used, Wootility is on another level, especially when it comes to switch configuration and performance tweaking, and this along with the myriad of other features offered here is why Wootility is my golden standard for HE boards going forward, as I haven't seen a driver that comes remotely close to the functionality and usage experience of Wootility. Alright, in closing, overall I'm incredibly impressed with the Wooting 60HE V2. I know I probably sound like I'm glazing a bit here, but I'm genuinely really struggling to find any major issues with the board, as it includes great accessories, has incredible build quality, the best warranty coverage I've seen on a keyboard to date, industry-leading serviceability and moddability, fantastic stock switches and support for every single magnetic switch type on the market, fantastic hardware performance, and the board supports a boatload of performance features, and has the option for a split spacebar far, which is very well implemented. The keycaps are great compared to most HE keyboards. The board's keycap and ergonomic profiles are great. It has fantastic lighting and the best software I've ever seen on an HE board to date that comes in both web-based and installable forms. To be completely honest, the only issue areas quote-unquote I have with the board is that the base feet are a little too small in my opinion. There's no height adjustment and the stock stabilizers for the larger keys are a little loose. And while the 60% profile isn't the greatest for me personally speaking when it comes to general use, all these issues are very minimal nitpicks, and overall the board is still really good, but I would love to see an 80% HE V2 with the same features and specs, as that would likely be endgame for me as I prefer that layout. However, price is absolutely a factor here, as the 60 HE V2 and all of Wooting boards for that matter are priced quite high, especially compared to more budget-oriented HE keyboards. But considering the positives of the board and the 4-year warranty, the price is worth it in my opinion, as I don't think there's another keyboard on the market that can compete with the 60 HE V2's serviceability, moddability, performance, and software, at least as of right now. But with that, that's everything for today's episode of the mel0n review. Thank you very much for watching, and thanks again to Wooting for sending the 60 HE V2 over for review. If you enjoyed the review and want to support my efforts with these in-depth reviews, the teardown project, and the guides, consider becoming a channel member here on YouTube, as that is the best way to directly support the channel aside from leaving a like on this video, subscribing, and sharing the video with a friend. Being a member also gives you exclusive early access to upcoming content, such as videos like this one, so if you want to support what I do here on the channel, consider becoming a member today. Thanks again for watching my review of the Wooting 60 HE V2, and I'll catch y'all in the next episode of the mel0n review. Peace.